Okay, so in talking about Abraham in Romans chapter 4, we know that he was called by God and that he was declared righteous by God before the law of Moses, which then is used by Paul to teach us that a person is righteous apart from the law, not by observing the law, but apart from the law. You don't become in right standing with God by observing the law. And he uses Abraham as the proof. It's historical proof. And that's why there's nothing, anybody can argue. If somebody tries to convince you, now that you're a Christian, you should obey the laws of God so that you can stay saved or so that you can be righteous. And it's like, no, that's not how God designed the gospel. And that's why you have Abraham to look to. And that's why we have to study Abraham much closer than a lot of other people. So when we were talking about Abraham being in right standing with God, we talked about the fact that he was declared righteous before he was circumcised. And so the need for somebody to be under the law, which is, I have to convert, look at it this way. The process is something like this. I'm a Gentile. If I was in those days, right, in the early church, I'm a Gentile. I know nothing about the God of the Bible, but I learn about Jesus, how Jesus is the sacrifice that has been raised from the dead, and he paid for all my sins. And so he fulfilled all the Jewish scriptures. Well, now I want to learn more and more about the Jewish scriptures. Well, if you want to learn more and more about the Jewish scriptures, and if you really want to be saved, then you should convert to Judaism. And then being a Jew in your religion, then you can be saved by following Jesus Christ. And it's like, oh, that's why it's so important for me to be circumcised so that I can convert into the Jewish faith, because Jesus came to save the Jews, right? The Messiah. He's the Messiah of the Jews. And so that's why that constant thought you have to deal with in Acts chapter 15, where the Jewish people said, unless these Gentiles get circumcised, they can't be saved. You guys remember that verse, right? In Acts chapter 15, unless you're circumcised, you can't be saved. Well, I want to get saved. I guess I got to get circumcised, and I got to go into the Jewish, laws. So that's why if Paul never taught the gospel, look at it that way. If Paul never taught the gospel the way he's teaching it here in Romans, all of us would be practicing Jews who are believers in Jesus. We would be following every single letter of the law of Moses, as well as believing in Jesus. That's how Christianity would look like. And then anybody who's not doing what we're doing, they're not saved. So we would be the only ones who are saved because we're following the law of Moses. So that's why Paul has to explain this, to set the Gentiles free. That's why Paul is an apostle to the Gentiles and has to explain both to the Jews and the Gentiles that you're not under the law, and that Abraham already proved that you can be righteous before God apart from observing the law. So it was, we got to where, I guess we can go to verse 13, and I don't know if I'm going to process it backwards and forwards here, but it says in verse 13, chapter 4 of Romans, verse 13, it was not through law that Abraham and his offspring received the promise. So when we're looking at Abraham and his offspring, we're talking about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Those three primarily. And then obviously after Jacob, you have the Israel and the 12 tribes of Israel. You guys understand that Jacob's name was changed to Israel. But it says it was not through law that Abraham and his offspring received the promise. Now, what is the promise? Okay, there's the promise found in Genesis chapter 12, which says, I will make you into a great nation. Let me just read it so that at least I'm quoting it accurately. In Genesis chapter 12, and you guys obviously feel free to go there. Genesis chapter 12, I will make you into a great nation. And you've got to process it with the understanding that God meant that Abraham would be a father of many nations. And he is the father of this great nation, just like in the United States. Like, who do we consider the father of the United States? Does anybody know?
Abraham Lincoln.
You're close, but it's George Washington, right? And the reason why it's George Washington is because he's the first president. That makes sense, right? So the idea that Abraham was given this promise, right? I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great. It's going to be famous, and you will be a blessing. Now God's going to use you to be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse.
Wow.
Talk about God's protection, right? And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. See, so this is one of the promises that God gave to Abraham. God also gave another promise to Abraham relating to the land. When God said to him, I will give you this land forever. So he's giving Abraham the blessing, he's giving Abraham the land, and then in chapter 15, God says to Abraham, see those stars in the sky? Go ahead and count them if you can, because as many as the stars are in the sky, so shall your offspring be. That's how many descendants you're going to have. That's all of Abraham. That means Abraham will be the father of all those stars, of all those descendants, of all those offspring. He's going to be the father of them all. God designed it that way for Abraham. That's the design of the blessing. So the design of the blessing consists of what we found. I will bless you and you will be a blessing. You will be a great nation. You're going to have as many descendants as the stars are in the sky. And all the land that you see, I will give it to you. So that these promises that God gave to Abraham, God didn't give it to him because Abraham observed the law. He didn't work or did anything, right? God says, I'm going to give it to you. And it wasn't because Abraham observed the law. It wasn't because Abraham did any good works. Why is that? Why is it that God gave him these promises without Abraham observing the law? Why?
Because of his faith.
That's not the answer I'm looking for. Why is it because he didn't do it because of the law? Let's talk. Why is it?
I know the answer, but I can't get it out. Hang on.
You know the answer, but you can't get it out?
Yeah.
So how come God
We-
gave the promises to Abraham without Abraham observing the law?
Because of Abraham's righteousness?
Because he believed in God. He had total faith
Well,
in God.
You guys are kind of there, but the answer I was looking for is because the law wasn't there yet.
Oh, that's yeah. So
Moses
true.
I
wasn't
remember.
there yet to give the law
Impossible.
to Abraham.
There's no law for him to follow. Moses wasn't alive yet. He wasn't born yet. And that's proof again that God gave these promises, the blessings of what I just described, right? It's given to Abraham, not because of the law. And we're able to say, because the law wasn't there. So again, establishing you receive this promise from God and his descendants because the law wasn't there. Abraham, okay, he was before the law. His son, Isaac, before the law. Jacob and the 12 tribes, they're all before the law. And they're all heirs of this promise. They all receive this promise because of Abraham's faith and then his faith being passed down to the next generation. Okay? Are you guys following that so far as to what he says here in Romans 4? That I'll read it one more time. It was not, verse 13, 4:13, it was not through law that Abraham and his offspring received the promise. And again, how come? The law wasn't there yet. But he would be an heir of the world, which I have to, process. What does it mean for Abraham to be the heir of the world? It's got to be the world in a sense that the land, but it's got to be in a spiritual sense, which is the new heaven and the new earth. I can't connect it to the earthly world because the earthly world is not what Abraham was looking for when God told him that he would receive this land forever. So it's got to be spiritual. And if you guys want to debate or discuss that, we're free to discuss it. But it says that he would be heir of the world, but through the righteousness that comes by faith. So he received, or he became heir, right? He became heir of the promise. And some of you got the answer right because of the righteousness that comes by faith. So you have to contrast. There's the righteousness that comes by faith, and there's the righteousness that comes by the law. Well, he couldn't be righteous by the law because it wasn't there. So as you process the way God gives his promise and the inheritance, you receive the inheritance, the way it's designed is that you have to be righteous in order to receive the promises of God. In order for the promises to go into effect, you have to be righteous. Okay, well, if I have to be righteous, then there's two ways: by observing the law or by faith. And since there's no law, he received it. He received his righteousness because of his faith. So the steps that are there. Well, let me see if I can illustrate it, because this needs to hit home, and it's so appropriate to visualize it so it'll help you with your understanding. So here's God. And here is Abraham. Abram for short. And God says, in order for you to receive the promise, Abraham must be righteous. Which means Abraham, his descendant Isaac, and then from Isaac to Jacob, which is the 12 tribes of Israel. And that's what we're looking at. Okay? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, 12 tribes of Israel. Okay? They received God's promise only if they are righteous. And the only way they can be righteous right? They can be righteous is how? The way
By
Abraham became righteous, which is by faith. Okay? So it was because of Abraham's faith, right? He became righteous. He received God's promise. Isaac also became righteous. Jacob also became righteous because, and this is all by faith, not by the law, because the law is not there. You cannot find the law of God in the book of Genesis. The laws of God are found in the book of Exodus, which is after they left Egypt. So when you look at this, the question is, how do you get God's promise, God's promises, right? God works with promises. You have to be righteous in order to receive the promise. And if you're not righteous, will you get God's promise? The promise of blessing, if you're not righteous?
No.
I'm helping you process this. You're not going to get God's promise if you're not righteous, right?
Correct.
So the goal, which is what we've been talking about, is we need to make sure you get to a place where you are counted righteous by God. And so to get to the place where you're going to receive God's promise, you have to be righteous. And in order for you to be righteous, you have a choice, either by faith or by the law. And since you can't be righteous by observing the law, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and the 12 tribes could not be righteous by observing the law. How come they could not be righteous by observing the law?
Because there was no law.
Because there's no law. Moses is not even around. So it's not just Abraham, but it says, and his, how is it worded? And his offspring. See? So Abraham's offspring are able to receive the promise as well. Now look at Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and the 12 tribes. Were any of them perfect?
By no means.
By no means they were not perfect. They were all, from our perspective, they were all sinners. And because we know the law, they're all lawbreakers. But they're still able to receive the promise of God because of their faith. And it's the kind of faith that Abraham had. So when we tell people it's by faith that God puts you right, it's not just easy believism like, oh yeah, I believe. Just like I believe there's George Washington, I believe there's Abraham, I believe there's Jesus. That's called a mental assent. And it's not that kind of faith. The kind of faith is in the bottom of your heart, deep in your heart, you're saying, with everything that's in me, I'm putting my trust in God. With everything that's in me, I'm putting my trust in Jesus. That's the kind of faith that Abraham had. And because we're talking about Abraham and his offspring, Isaac had that, Jacob had that. And the 12 tribes of Israel, they had that as well. We just have to kind of process that the best way we can when it says this verse, it was not through law that Abraham and his offspring received the promise. I'm reading Romans 4:13, that he would be heir of the world. See, so the promise is what? Being heir of the world. So, what's the promise? Here's the world. And Abraham, how's that look? Abraham, you're going to inherit the world. Right? You're an heir
Question.
of the world. Now, we can look at the whole world, which to me, that fits. But we can also look at a certain part of the world, maybe. Because when we're talking about a new heaven and a new earth, and Abraham is going to inherit the whole world, God is going to create a new heaven and a new earth, but he's also going to create a new Jerusalem. So to inherit, the new Jerusalem is inheriting the world also. So however that is processed, the point is God is giving it to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and all the descendants of Abraham. And not because of the law, but because of their faith, starting with Abraham. Manny, what is your thought?
It's off the wall. It's like any other thought of mine. Do you think Abraham really knew what that meant when God said you're going to inherit the whole world, you're going to be an heir to, the world? I think that's a little too much for a human being to comprehend. That's just my thought.
Yeah, I mean, when you have a
Probably not.
relationship with God, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're not always going to be fully understanding everything that God says. So
Right.
you'll take what God gives you, but will you fully understand it? And maybe it's a growing understanding or a growing knowledge, because the same way with the Jews expecting their Messiah, they were expecting another person like Moses, delivering them from the Egyptians. Instead, Jesus came differently. See? So how much did Abraham understand? That's one of those things where we can't really fully understand it, but do you want a clue of what he understood? Yes, you want a clue?
Yes,
Let's go to
yes.
Hebrews chapter 11, which is actually what we studied in Saturday.
Hebrews 11. Okay.
Yeah, so go to Hebrews 11. Okay. Now, do you guys know that God is a builder? This is not Bob the builder. This is God the builder. Do you know that God is a builder? Okay, so
Yeah.
Yes.
God
Planner,
is a
builder.
builder. Huh?
The one who built the world.
So he's a builder. And number two, do you know he's also the architect?
Yes,
Mhm.
everything.
Okay, so since we look at God as a builder and architect, in Hebrews chapter 11, this is what it says.
Hebrews or Romans?
No, Hebrews 11 is a cross-reference to the understanding of your question that you were asking. Did
Okay,
Abraham
sorry.
fully understand what God was talking about when he said that he would be heir of the world?
Sorry.
I'm following your question, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so here's the answer. It says in verse 10, regarding Abraham, it says, For Abraham was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. Okay. See, Abraham was the one looking forward to that. So, what we're piecing together is, yeah, there's a city. And God is the architect and the builder of this city. And Abraham was looking forward to living in that city. Think of the most beautiful buildings here in the world, right? They're nothing compared to the city that God's going to build, where he is also the architect of that city. And we know that city to be the New Jerusalem because we read that in Revelation. But God is the builder, God is the architect, and we're going to be going there. And Abraham, well, let's keep it with Abraham. Abraham was looking forward to that. Does that answer your question about how much did Abraham really know? When God said he would be heir, it looks like he knew this part of it.
Yes.
He knew about this. And if you study what's being discussed in Hebrews 11, it's like when Abraham was living on earth, he counted himself as a stranger. And that's in my Hebrew study. He counted himself as a stranger here on earth because he's looking forward to this city where he's going to belong, where God's going to be. And God is the builder, God is the architect, and God's going to be there. These are the promises that Abraham seemed to have understood, and his children, Isaac, Jacob, grandchildren, Israel, they somehow understood that there's a promise that is taking shape like this. See? Is he receiving all these promises because they observed the law? No, the law wasn't there yet. So the more you understand how Abraham is receiving these promises apart from the law, then that helps build your understanding of the gospel. He's using this to teach you how the gospel works. There's a promise attached to the cross. There's a promise attached to Jesus. Right? You guys understand there's a promise attached to Jesus, right?
Yes.
Okay, name them. At least one or two.
Promises that all of our sins will be wiped away.
There you go. That's one. What's another one?
That we are guaranteed that we're going to be in heaven because our faith is in Jesus.
So that's another promise. You'll be in heaven, which to us, because of Revelation, we're going to be in that New Jerusalem. We're going to be in that new heaven and the new earth. Heaven, where we'll see God. We'll live with God in this dimension of the new heaven and the new earth and the new Jerusalem.
Another promise?
If you can think of one, sure.
That mansion that we're going to be in, there's going to be so many doors and hiding places.
Right.
The table.
In my Father's house are many mansions, or are many rooms, Jesus says. So I go to prepare a place for you. Those are the promises attached to believing in Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
See? And that's why when we understand this story of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and being able to be receiving God's promises because of faith, then you'll understand the gospel better, how it works. Is that helping you guys?
Yes.
Okay. I hope it does. So that's to answer your question, Manny. Now let's go back to Romans chapter 4. Now in verse 14, so he says, but through the righteousness that comes by faith, right? Verse 14 says, for if those who live by law are heirs, okay. So now let's look at another page. Now see, because Paul processes this for us, he says, okay, if we're talking about the law, right? The law of Moses. And if you are a person who observes the law and thinking that if you observe the law, that you will be first righteous, right? Because he has to address the lawyers, right? Right? The righteous, you'll be righteous. And when you are righteous, you'll be an heir to the promise. If those who live by law are heirs, and if this is the design that you think God has for us, if you think this is the design, he's saying, well, let's put this together with God. God gave the law through Moses. And if you think God is going to make you an heir of the promise because you observe the law, then what's going to happen with Abraham? Because he was righteous, and he received the promise. He received the promise. How did he receive the promise?
Through faith.
By
Through
faith.
faith.
So he's saying, if God gave the promise to Abraham by faith, but you're saying people observe the law to become righteous and so that they can be an heir of God's promise, he says, for if those who live by law are heirs, faith has no value. So what happens to faith? That faith that Abraham exercised, no value. So faith has no value, and the promise that God gave to Abraham is what? It says
Worthless.
it's worthless. It means nothing. You see what Paul has to deal with? So Abraham's faith is worthless. Faith is useless. Faith is useless, and the promise is worthless. Or faith has no value, and the promise is worthless. And then verse 15, because law, what does the law bring? What's the design of the law?
Wrath.
It says, what's that?
The wrath.
Brings wrath. So when you are a person who follows the law, what the law does is it brings wrath. When does the law bring wrath? When? See, so you're having an understanding of the difference between the law and the promise, how it works to God. How does the law bring wrath to you?
If you don't follow the law,
That's right.
Yeah.
What's that? When you break it, when you don't follow it, wrath is, every violation and disobedience must receive its just punishment. So the wrath of
right.
God will go to those who observe the law. And so he says, because, verse 15, because law brings wrath. And where there is no law between this person who's under the law and Abraham, which is Abraham? I mean, who's the person who's not living under the law in this diagram?
Abraham.
So here, no law, and
No
where
sin.
it says where there is no law,
There's no transgressions.
so because there's no law, this is logic, right? This is legal minds at work. He says there's no, what's transgression? Does anybody have a different translation besides no transgression?
Knowing the law and you break it still. Somebody said it already, but you still broke it.
Are you reading your text, or are you coming up with your own thoughts?
No, I read that. I read that it's regarding a law.
Well, I'm trying to understand verse 15. So look at verse 15 to see what it says.
And where there is, because the law brings wrath, and where there is no law, there is no transgressions.
Okay, so no transgression. That's the word I'm looking for.
Oh, okay.
What does transgression mean?
That's what I'm trying to say. The
Infringement or violation of a law, command, or duty.
breaking of a law. Or probably a sin.
Sin, right? Transgressions.
Sin.
Yeah, it's the breaking of the law. When there's no law, there's no transgression. That makes sense, doesn't it? How
Yeah,
can you break the law of God when there's no law to break? And that's what Abraham is, a person who's not under the law. And if there's no transgression, you can put the pieces together. When there's no let me see what it says in my diction. If anybody wants to look up a dictionary definition of law, feel free to look it up. But in the meantime, since there's no law, there's no transgression. And this is covered in chapter 2, right? In a different angle. But the principle of no law, no transgression, in this context, we're talking about Abraham, right? Well, Abraham wasn't under any law, and there's no transgression.
Pastor Bert,
yeah.
Can I say something about law in the dictionary?
Yes, but remember, there's a different understanding of the law, because we're talking about the law of Moses in the Bible. Okay. So that's what we mean by law when we're talking about from the frame reference. Your frame of reference is the law of Moses, or the biblical frame of reference is the law of Moses. Not the laws in the in the state or in countries. This is Moses. So if you want to share that, feel free to, but we are going with the definition of the law as Moses.
It says, I was looking at the Bible dictionary.
Oh, good. Okay, Bible dictionary is going to be helpful. Go ahead.
It refers at once to the commandment of God as the foundation of all human duty.
Okay, see, it says all human duty. Okay.
Yes.
Not our context. Moses gave the commandments of God to not all humans, to the Jews only, Israel only. So that's why you got to be careful, right, with these definitions. Go on. It's not for the whole human race. It's for Israel.
Yes, that's what it says here. Moses.
Does it say Israel or human race?
Human duty. It says human duty.
Oh, okay. I misunderstood then. I thought he was talking about all humans.
Foundation of all human duty. It's actually short, the law of Moses.
Yeah, that's what we want to say. That's pretty much
Okay.
it. Okay, so transgression. We were looking up the word transgression, meaning sin. Is that right? You know, they're synonymous with words like trespasses, sin.
It says fault, offense, or crime in the Bible dictionary.
Okay, fault.
Offense or
What's
crime.
your fault? Your fault is you're breaking the law.
Crime
What's your offense? Your offense is breaking the law.
or crime.
Your crime against the law. Are you guys getting it? That's
Yes.
transgression. So when there's no law, there's no transgression.
Can I read this, Pastor Bert, the meaning in the Bible dictionary, transgression?
Sure.
The act of passing over or beyond any law or rule of moral duty, the violation of a law or known principle of rectitude, breach of command.
Okay. So it's consistent with when you're under the law, there's transgression. And when there's transgression, what should you expect? Wrath when you're under the law. But when you're not under the law, and Abraham was not under the law, because there is no law, and according to Paul's principle, when there's no law, there's no transgression. Right? Am I reading this right? And where there is no law, there is no transgression?
Yes.
See? So you're getting a better understanding of how the law works. Because the law brings wrath. And it brings wrath when you transgress the law, when you break the law. When there's no law, there's no transgression. Is that mind-blowing to you guys?
Well, can I say something, Pastor? I think
Yeah, let's talk about it because this is a difficult passage.
it's when you're not under the law, meaning you do not break the law, so there is no crime, there is no transgression.
Yeah, now try to make it specific to Abraham because that's the context.
When you're
I
not
know you want to take the principle of not being under the law, and that's later, but right now, Abraham was not under the law.
yes,
So
there's
Abraham had no transgressions.
yes, correct, because there's no law that he's not following, he's not under any law. So he doesn't commit any transgressions. So there is no wrath between him and God.
Yeah.
Okay.
Isn't that weird?
It's really weird.
It's a weird concept to grasp. And the reason why Paul is saying that is, remember, what God was looking for out of Abraham, he was not looking for his transgressions, he was looking for his faith so that he can receive the promise.
Yes.
Because the promise is only received by faith. And remember, before you can receive the promise, you have to be righteous. So how did Abraham become righteous?
Because of
By
belief.
faith. Yeah. So the faith is valuable, right? Faith is valuable as opposed to faith having no value, and the promise is worth a lot as opposed to being worthless. See, this is how God designed it for Abraham. This is how God is designing it for the gospel. It's all about the promise, and Abraham's trusting God for the promise. That's deep, I know, but if you have a problem with this, just look at it the other way. If you're under the law and you transgress against the law, and we all have, as a Jew anyway, right? Well, it brings wrath, which means it doesn't make you righteous. And if you're not righteous, you're not an heir. You don't receive God's promise if you're not righteous. Instead, you receive God's wrath. That's the alternative. There's only two alternatives here. You're either going to be like Abraham, or you're going to be like the law keepers, the law observers, who cannot be righteous by their observance of the law. I know it's deep, but we're working hard to understand this. Okay? I think that's as much as we can chew on right now. Let's talk about this some more, guys, so that you can really let this sink in. We got to read it again. It helps when we read it again, because it goes like this. It was not, verse 13, it was not through law that Abraham and his offspring received the promise that he would be heir of the world, but through the righteousness that comes by faith. For if those who live by law are heirs, faith has no value, and the promise is worthless, because law brings wrath. And where there is no law, there is no transgression. So he's going back and forth between inheriting God's promises by the law versus inheriting God's promise by faith.
So you're saying all the people before Abraham, there was no law, correct?
Yeah.
And
Before Abraham, you're talking about Noah. You're talking
Yeah.
about Cain and Abel. You're talking about Adam and Eve.
so they had to have, in order to receive the promises, they had to have faith. But there's no law.
Yeah.
See, I'm
There's an
confused on that.
interesting you're bringing up an interesting case where I'm trying to figure. I don't think there's any written record of God giving them any promises. Not like Abraham, right?
Right.
So
he
they
gave a
have
promise
something
to-
else in their relationship with God, but it wasn't the kind of promises that God gave to Abraham.
There was a promise to Noah. That's where he made the rainbow.
True. But that kind of promise is different from the kind of promise God gave to Abraham. But
Sure.
Abraham,
Okay.
Abraham did have faith. I mean, Noah did have faith, and, so did Abel. He had faith. But we're not talking about them receiving a promise that is similar or like the one that God gave to Abraham.
The one for Abraham is a lot bigger than Noah's.
Yeah, exactly. Because it's written. God's promise was to Noah and, in a sense, to the whole world, that he's not going to flood the whole world again, because that rainbow is going to be the sign that he's not going to destroy the world the same way he did it, when he flooded the earth through Noah's, when Noah built the ark. So it's a different kind of promise, right?
Yeah, I agree. It's a different promise, but yeah.
But their faith is acknowledged in Hebrews. It says they were commended for their faith. Noah was commended for his faith. Abel was commended for his faith. Enoch was commended for his faith. And Abel was commended for his faith also. I think it's Abel, Enoch, Noah. That's found in Hebrews 11. But it's not the same as Abraham's faith being used to teach us that you receive God's promise because of faith, not because of the law. That's why your object lesson has to be Abraham,
Mm-hmm.
because he takes the time. Remember, we were talking about Abraham's circumcision. So all those things, were part of studying Abraham and his faith. Anybody else have any thoughts? Let's process this, because this is how the gospel works. It's not through the law. It's through faith, the kind of faith that Abraham had in God's promise. Anybody else have any thoughts?
Come on. I
Yes,
know
Pastor
there
Bert.
you go.
Go ahead. Share your thoughts.
Oh, Pastor Bert. My question. I have a question.
Okay.
When God gave His promise, right, and to Abraham was righteous through faith, does it still apply like to all Jews and Gentiles? Not today. I
Yeah.
mean, like Israel, they're like fighting over the land and all that,
Okay. Now we're
because
talking about the meaning of God's promises, right?
yeah.
Now there is the physical, okay, and
Yeah.
that's why they're fighting over the land of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
There's the physical promise, but there's the spiritual promise.
Okay.
Abraham is focused on the spiritual promise,
Okay.
according to Hebrews 11. Here, remember, let me go back. Here, Abraham was focused on the world where God is the builder and the architect of the city. Do you want to live in a city where God is the builder and the architect, or do you want to live in Manila? Or do you want to live in Shanghai or San Francisco? God is building a city. It's going to be called the New Jerusalem. And the New Jerusalem is going to consist of God as the architect and the builder of this beautiful city. Who could do a better job than God, right? That's where your promise, we're talking about for us today because of Jesus. That's the promise that we're going to be living there. Right? Revelation 21. Just read Revelation 21.
Yeah.
Where we're going to be living with God. Okay? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yes, Pastor Bert. Thank you.
So Abraham had to look at something beyond the physical. Now he did deal with the physical land. Okay, and so did Isaac and Jacob.
Right.
Sure, they've dealt with the physical land, but Abraham's faith looked beyond the physical land because he was looking for the city where God would be the builder and the architect, according to Hebrews 11.
Now, I'm curious at that new city, that New Jerusalem. The Bible says that we're going to recognize each other, correct?
Just in print, not. I mean, you got to
In
look at it
principle.
based on a lot of studies, but yeah, you'll recognize each other. You're going to know everybody as everybody knows you.
Wow.
That's
So
going to be an
it's good.
amazing place.
Yeah. So
But that's what Abraham was. Abraham was given a revelation that the physical land that God promised him
mhm.
is not just the physical, but also the spiritual.
Yeah.
Remember, where God is the builder and architect. Right now, there's no cities in this world where God is the builder and the architect. Even the temple, he gave the instructions to Moses how to build the temple, but God is not the builder of that. It's Moses and the people of Israel are the ones who built it.
Yeah.
So
So-
we're going to know. So we're going to know our brothers and sisters are, but we're not
Yeah.
going to call them brothers and sisters, really.
Well, you're going to know as well as you are known. So you're going to know everything.
I cannot
Everybody's
comprehend
you're
that.
gonna recognize Abraham.
Yeah, our minds are too small to really comprehend the big picture.
Yeah. But that's way beyond our human, limitations
Ending. Yeah.
or our human understanding. But let me go to Revelation 21 just to refresh your memory. Verse 1, and we'll wrap it up with this, okay? Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Now the dwelling of God is with men, and he will live with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away." He who was seated on the throne said, "I am making everything new." Then he said, "Write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true." And so there it is. This is how faith works. God promises these things, and then we believe in those promises, not work for those promises. All right, guys. I think that's something happened with my board. Anyway. Okay, so that's as far as we got.
That was deep.
It's deep. And, receiving this instruction, you got to ask, why is Paul saying this? Right? Why? To make it absolutely clear to all of us that you receive the promise of God not by observing the law, not by any works. It's by faith, the kind of faith Abraham exercised. And so the more you focus on analyzing Abraham's faith, Isaac's faith, Jacob's faith, Joseph's faith, when you analyze their faith and how they lived their lives apart from the law, and yet they were counted as righteous by God because of their faith, that's what Paul is teaching. So today, we're teaching people to put their faith in Jesus. And by putting their faith in Jesus, they will receive all the promises that are attached to believing in Jesus, like Jesus dying for your sins, Jesus washing away all your sins, being forgiven of all your sins, Jesus promising you eternal life. You will be with him in heaven, and the promise that he will prepare a room for you or a mansion for you. All those things are the promises attached if you put your faith in Jesus, not because you're observing the law or working for it. It's a free gift. That's why it's called good news.
Yes. Thank you.
And anytime somebody tries to convince you, no, you got to follow the law, you got to do good works, you got to do this and that, and so now you understand. Well, if you put yourself under the law, you're going to receive wrath. That's what you're going to get. You really want to be under the law? Because if you're under the law brings wrath.
No, thank you.
That's why Paul, teaches in Romans 6, you're not under the law, you're under grace. But, okay, so we're going through this, and by God's grace, we're working it out. Okay, let's close in prayer. Who would like to close us?